Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. This is Salim Akhtar Malik, your host at the Observation Post channel. On this channel, I discuss with you issues of national and international importance, military technology, defense and security matters, as well as important events from military history. You can interact with me on this channel by giving your views and comments, which I hold very important to me because these help me in fine tuning my talks, which I deliver to you from time to time on this channel. You can also connect with me on Twitter, where my address is Salim Akhtar 53. Before we proceed further, I would request you to please subscribe to my channel by clicking the bell icon. So, in this session, I'll be talking to you about the Israeli covert operation in 1968, where the Israelis hijacked a ship on the high seas. The ship was loaded with 200 tons of raw uranium or yellowcake. After hijacking the ship, it was diverted to Israel, and the raw uranium was utilized for Israel's clandestine nuclear weapons program, which it had started with the French help somewhere in 1950s. Now there is a well-recorded history of the Israeli covert operations which involved theft and stealing of military technology as well as hardware and software pertaining to military equipment. And it also, as I said, had been clandestinely stealing the radioactive material for fueling its, again, secret nuclear reactors, which it had established in the 1950s for its nuclear program, that is the nuclear weapons program. Now, one feature of all these operations which Israel carried out to steal military technology as well as software, hardware, and contraband nuclear material, the main feature of such operations was that in every instance, in every case, the country which was involved, where Israel carried out the theft, always looked the other way or other side, and it feigned ignorance about the entire operation, about the entire Israeli theft and stealing operation. And only when Israel got away with what it had desired or what it had objected, only then the concerned government would open its eyes and raise an alarm and shed crocodile tears. And thereafter, as a whitewash, would punish some low level official by accusing him of being involved with the Israelis in carrying out the theft and the stealing. So, this had been the regular feature, this had been the pattern of all these covert operations which Israel carried out, particularly during the 1960s and 70s, as well as in 80s. The operation about which I am talking, Israel had organized and conducted this operation in 1968 after the 1967 war between the Arabs and Israel. Why did Israel hijack the ship which was loaded with 200 tons of uranium or raw uranium. It was because France, which had been supplying raw uranium to Israel for fueling the nuclear reactor at the place called Dimona in southern Israel. Israel had carried out a commando operation against Beirut International Airport in which its commandos had destroyed a number of civilian aircraft parked on the runways of Beirut International Airport. And Israel said that it had launched that operation in retaliation for or in retaliation to the Palestine Liberation Organization's operations against Israel from the Lebanese territory. So, as a result of this operation, as a result of this covert Israeli commando operation, the French government laid an embargo on all the military supplies to Israel, including the supply of uranium, that is raw uranium, to fuel the Israeli nuclear reactor, which was producing plutonium for the Israeli nuclear weapons at Dimona in southern Israel. So, since Israel was expanding its nuclear arsenal, it required fresh supplies of uranium for which it had to look elsewhere and find a new source. Hence, the operation, which was called Operation Plumbat. Now, Plumbat is derived from the Latin word plumbum, which means lead. So it was called Operation Plumbat because the containers or the casks in which the raw uranium was loaded were labeled as plumbat. That is, they were containing lead. So let us go into the background of the Israeli nuclear program. As I said, it was started somewhere in the 1950s. At that time, the Arabs had boycotted the Israeli state, that is the Jewish state, and had declared that they would destroy Israel. And they had also declared that Israel was nothing more than another crusader state which would die its own death, its natural death in due course of time. Now, crusader states were the tiny states which were established by the crusaders during the crusades which they had launched against the Muslims. And as a result of that, they had established those states which were eventually destroyed by Salahuddin Ayyubi and his heirs. So those crusader states ceased to exist, and the modern Arab rulers, particularly Jamal Abdel Nasser, who was then the president of Egypt, or the United Arab Republic as it was called at that time, he said he would often say that Israel was a crusader state which would die its own death in due course of time. So the Israeli leaders were wary of this, and they wanted to make sure that this would not happen, that Israel would not have the fate of the crusader states. And David Ben-Gurion, who was the founder and first prime minister of Israel, would often say that Einstein, Oppenheimer, and Teller, who had designed and produced the atomic bomb for America, were all Jewish. They were Jewish scientists who had through their research and technical know-how, designed and then facilitated the production of the American nuclear bomb. So if they could do this for America, why couldn't the Jewish scientists and Jewish technological know-how be used for producing a nuclear bomb for Israel and for making Israel a nuclear power? So in 1956, Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal, which was up till then under the control of France and England. France and England were jointly controlling the Suez Canal, which was constructed by them during the colonial period. And when the Egyptian government nationalized the Suez Canal in 1956, the French and British control ended. Control over the Suez Canal ended, and France then prompted the Israeli leaders to invade Egypt, and they said that the Israeli invasion would be followed by an air offensive by the French and British air forces, and this would result in Suez Canal again falling into the hands of France and Britain, and as a quid pro quo or as a gesture of gratitude and in return for the Israeli invasion of Egypt, France would help Israel in becoming a nuclear power by providing them not only technological know-how, but also in building a nuclear reactor in Israel. So Israelis agreed and they invaded Egypt. And as planned, the French and British air forces also attacked Egypt, but then the operation failed. And as a result of the intervention by the Soviet Union and the United States, a ceasefire was brokered between the belligerents through the United Nations, and the Israelis, they went back to their positions, to their peacetime locations, and also France and Britain vacated their aggression against Egypt. But then, as a quid pro quo and as the fulfillment of its promise, which France had made to Israel before the Suez crisis, France then provided nuclear technology and helped Israel in building a nuclear reactor. So it initially built two nuclear reactors. One was called L, and it was 24 kilowatts. It had the power of 24 kilowatts, and then a second nuclear reactor, three times larger than L, was also constructed, and thus started the Israeli nuclear program. And for fueling the reactors, France provided raw uranium or yellowcake to Israel from its French colonies. So the raw uranium is mined in West Africa in the former French colonies. At that time, all those countries were French colonies, and they are Niger, Chad, and Mali. So we don't know specifically from which country France provided the uranium ore or yellow cake to Israel, but it did provide Israel with yellow cake till 1968 when it laid an embargo on the supply of uranium as well as military supplies to Israel. But then French had shown duplicity in case of the embargo on military equipment. They had provided the embargoed Mirages, 50 embargoed Mirages, which were to be delivered to Israel and whose delivery was stopped as a result of the 1968 Israeli commando raid on Beirut airport. They ultimately provided those aircraft in knockdown condition, packed in crates. They were sent to Israel and thereafter they were assembled by Israeli technicians and they were then inducted into Israeli Air Force. Likewise, there were 4 or 5 missile ships which were being constructed in France at a French shipyard in Cherbourg, which is on the English Channel coast. Those missile ships were also embargoed in 1968, but then the French looked the other side or the other way when Israelis were allowed to hijack those missile ships under the very nose of the French authorities. So in this case also, France would have been providing Israel with yellow cake or raw uranium clandestinely, but then probably Israel wanted to have an additional source or a reserve source for fueling its nuclear reactors. So it planned an operation, a covert operation. The operation was planned by Mossad, Israel's secret service. As a result of that operation, Israel Israeli agents bought raw uranium on the black market in Belgium from a Belgian company, and they also bought a Liberian ship on which the raw uranium bought from the Belgian company was loaded, and then it steered, the ship steered towards the Italian port of Genoa. So this was done at Antwerp, the Belgian port of Antwerp, where the Liberian ship was bought as well as the uranium yellow cake. It was bought on the black market. So when the ship was on the high seas, that is after about 7 days, when it sailed from Antwerp, it was stopped by the Israeli Navy and the ship was sort of hijacked. The crew, the Spanish crew of the ship, were removed and it was then manned by the Israeli crew. And thereafter, the Israelis took the ship to Israel, where the stolen and smuggled raw uranium was utilized, as I said, in the nuclear weapons program which Israel had initiated with the help of France during the Cold War, that is, during the 1950s. So the main actors in this drama were France, Belgium. Liberia is a third or fourth world country we discounted, and this is how it happened. This is also all what I wanted to say in this session. See you in the next session with a new video. Till then, bye bye.